3rd November 1944, 23:11. Exmoor Moors, Devonshire, England. The fog had not crept in. It had fallen. 10 minutes earlier, the half-moon had still burned through torn clouds, and Lieutenant Arthur Grayson could see the thin line of hawthorn trees and the glint of waterlogged ditches. Now the world ended 2 paces from his boots. Beyond that, a solid white wall, dense and wet, clinging to his face, his eyelashes, his breath. The Bedford truck had buried itself to the axles in black peat. Each spin of the wheels only chewed the ground deeper, throwing up clumps of sodden turf. The engine coughed twice, shuddered, and died with a final, wet rattle. The sudden absence of mechanical noise made the silence heavier, as if someone had dropped a blanket over the entire moor. The patrol consisted of 8 men from a line regiment that had already seen too many campaigns. Collins, the sergeant, a broad-shouldered veteran of North Africa and Italy, had a faded scar along his jaw and the habit of checking the horizon every few seconds, even when there was no horizon to see. James, the radio operator, carried his set like a lifeline. Harris, the youngest, barely 20, still moved with the nervous energy of someone who had not yet learned how quickly men could disappear. Parker, the medic, had ink stains on his fingers from filling out casualty forms by hand. Their faces, steady at dusk, now looked tight and gray in the weak circle of the lantern hanging from the truck's side. War had taught them the logic of artillery barrages, the angles of machine gun fire, the killing radius of a mortar bomb. This night did not follow any of those rules. James bent over the radio set and worked the dials with practiced precision. The headphones crackled in his hands, spitting only layers of static. No faint voice, no distant call sign, no reassuring click of recognition. Just a continuous grinding hiss that seemed to thicken the air. The compass was no more cooperative. The needle jerked back and forth between north and south, quivering as if under strain. Once it swung a full half circle, hesitated over east, and then froze at a meaningless angle. On previous campaigns, Collins had seen this only near high-tension wires and heavy equipment. Here, on a moor miles from any power line, it made no sense at all. Grayson measured distances in his head. They were roughly 12 miles from the last known friendly position, on a narrow track that ran like a vein through the open moorland. Visibility, less than 3 meters. Temperature, just above freezing, heavy damp pressing through wool and canvas. Time until dawn, 4.5 hours. Under normal conditions, an experienced patrol could cover the distance back on foot in a night. Under these conditions, one wrong step could lead into a peat hole that had been swallowing men, horses, and cattle since before the Romans. He sent them out in pairs to feel for the edge of the track, to judge the ground, to make sure the truck was not perched on the lip of something that would open beneath its weight. Boots squelched into waterlogged turf and vanished into the fog. Sound died quickly tonight. The rhythm of footsteps faded after a few seconds, swallowed by the wet silence. After that, there was only the faint creaking of leather, the distant call of a bird, and the slow drip of condensed moisture from the truck's metal frame. 2 minutes passed, then 3, then 5. Somewhere out in the white, Collins raised his voice, calling Private Thomas by name. The words did not carry far. They were absorbed, dampened, smothered. No reply came back. No shot, no scuffle, no cry. Thomas, who had been complaining about his boots and humming dance tunes under his breath an hour earlier, had simply ceased to exist. There was no point at which anyone could say, Here is where he was lost. One moment the patrol counted 8 men. The next, it counted 7. Grayson recognized the cold tightening beneath his ribs. It was not panic. Panic was loud and hot and frantic. This was the opposite, a deliberate sharpening of awareness, the same sensation he had felt once in Italy when he realized too late that what he had taken for a stone wall was the edge of a ravine. While he was still weighing options, the sound came. It was not a sound he could easily classify. At first he tried to push it into the familiar shape of wind, a long, drawn-out murmur across open ground, falling through leafless branches. But there was no wind. The fog stood motionless, a suspended ocean. The bare hawthorns at the edge of his memory did not move. The whisper had no clear source. It seemed to rise from the wet ground, bleed from the fog itself, press against the skin rather than enter through the ears. It crawled along the back of his neck and down his spine like cold water. The language was unfamiliar, and yet carried weight. Harsh, guttural consonants, dragged-out endings, a rhythm closer to chant than to speech. It was not German, not French, not the Latin he had translated at Cambridge when he still thought his life would be spent in libraries and trench cuts instead of trenches. It felt older than any language he knew, older than the maps that had carved this island into counties and parishes. One by one, the others began to hear it. Their shoulders stiffened. Heads turned slightly as if they could pinpoint a direction. They could not. The sound refused to obey normal geometry. It came from in front of them, behind them, above them, and from just under the soles of their boots. The patrol regrouped by the dead truck, pulled in by instinct as much as discipline. Counting heads in the dim light confirmed what they already felt. Still, only 7. No one had seen Thomas fall. No one had heard him speak a last word. A man had just been edited out of the night. Grayson adjusted his estimate again. 7 men, 12 miles of uncertain ground, fog that interfered with radio and compass as effectively as any electronic jamming, an unknown source of sound that did not obey distance. He ordered them to stay close, to hold formation, to treat the fog itself as hostile terrain. Every movement now was deliberate, measured in feet rather than yards. The whisper thickened. It no longer resembled scattered fragments of noise. It became structured, phrases rising and falling in a cadence that suggested purpose. While the words themselves remained meaningless, the intent bled through. Something was aware of them. Not in the vague way an animal might be aware of movement at the edge of its vision, but in the focused way a hunter is aware of specific prey. A faint tremor ran through the fog ahead. At first it looked like nothing more than a subtle change in density, a slight darkening that could have been a trick of the eyes, a smear on the lantern glass. But the change persisted. Within the white mass, darker vertical shapes began to form. Long, narrow, lacking any clear outline, they stood in a loose curve, facing the truck. They did not advance. They simply existed. Like an audience in a darkened theater, arranged just beyond the edge of the footlights. Grayson's training, honed across 3 campaigns, placed his rifle in his hands almost automatically. The stock settled into the groove of his shoulder. His cheek found its place along the worn wood. The front sight sought the center of one of the gray columns. His breathing fell into the familiar pattern. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Pause. Gentle pressure on the trigger. The mechanism responded. The faint metallic click was real, solid. The weapon had a live round chambered, the safety off, the bolt properly seated. His finger applied enough pressure to fire. Nothing happened. There was no recoil, no muzzle flash, no crack rolling off into the fog. It was as if an invisible hand had reached into the rifle and removed the moment of ignition from the sequence. Every component worked. The result did not occur. In that instant, Grayson understood that whatever rules governed this piece of ground tonight were not the rules of conventional warfare. Steel, powder, and drilled reflexes had less authority here than something else. The whisper swelled, pressing harder against his skull. A dull ache began to form behind his eyes, a deep, grinding pressure that reminded him uncomfortably of the nights he had spent bent over Celtic inscriptions by lamplight, when the letters seemed to crawl on the page if he stared too long. Back then, the worst consequence had been a headache and a missed breakfast. Now, the cost felt higher. Somewhere beyond the white curtain, a dog began to howl. The sound did not resemble the sharp, practical barking of farm dogs he remembered from Yorkshire. This was a long, drawn-out note, rising slowly and falling even slower, saturated with an ancient, almost human sorrow. It cut through the whispering chant like a knife, then merged with it, becoming another layer in the night's strange chorus. Parker's knees buckled. His hand closed around the nearest piece of solid metal, the truck's side panel, as if anchoring himself to something that still obeyed ordinary weight and balance. Harris swallowed hard enough for his throat to click, his young face drained of color. Fragments of old stories surfaced unbidden in Grayson's mind. Whitby, the ruined abbey on the cliff, his grandmother's voice warning about black dogs on the moors that did not belong to any farmer and came for those who answered their call. He had dismissed those tales as the debris of an older, more frightened world. The Exmoor air tonight made them feel less like debris and more like field reports from an unacknowledged front. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was not simply the absence of sound. It carried weight. It pressed against the eardrums, amplified the tiny noises that remained. The ragged shift of cloth, the faint creak of leather, the slow tick of cooling metal in the truck's engine block. The fog ahead of them shivered. For a moment it seemed to ripple, as if stirred by a gust of wind that did not touch their faces. Then it drew back in a smooth, impossible motion, peeling away like a curtain. What stood beyond it made the rational part of Grayson's mind search desperately for ordinary explanations. The shape solidified. Gray figures in a shallow arc, perhaps a dozen at first glance, then more as his eyes adjusted. The lines of their uniforms were painfully familiar. The cut of field gray tunics, the shapes of helmets, the glint of metal belt buckles catching the lantern's weak light. Wehrmacht equipment, worn and scuffed, mud on the boots, straps hanging at slightly crooked angles, as if put on in haste. It would have been a scene he had glimpsed many times before, German infantry appearing out of smoke, if not for the faces. The faces were wrong. The skin was too pale, not the pallor of men who had spent weeks away from the sun, but the flat, almost waxen absence of true color. The eyes, where he could see them beneath helmet rims, seemed either too dark or too light, as if the iris and pupil had bled together. Some mouths hung slightly open, not in exhaustion, but in a static, frozen slackness, like masks that had been set in one expression and forgotten. One figure stood half a step ahead of the others. The insignia on its collar tabs marked an officer's rank, though the details blurred at the edges of Grayson's vision. The head tilted, just fractionally, as if considering them. The lips moved. Sound rolled across the moor, shaped into a single recognizable word in harsh, clipped German, directed straight at the cluster of British uniforms by the dead truck. In that moment, Grayson understood two things with absolute clarity. First, the men standing in front of him, whether they still qualified as men or not, were aware of who he and his patrol were. This was not a random haunting or an echo of some past battle. This was directed attention. Second, the most dangerous part of this night would not be the fact that enemy soldiers, living or otherwise, had found them in the fog. The true threat lay in whatever had changed the nature of the fog, silenced the rifle, twisted the compass, and rewritten the rules of the moor. The Germans, dead-eyed in the lantern light, were only its first, deliberate introduction. Arthur William Grayson was born 14th of March 1917 in Whitby, Yorkshire, a town where the ruins of an ancient abbey stood on a cliff like broken teeth above the North Sea. His father worked as a harbor master, his mother as a seamstress. He had one younger sister, Eleanor, who died of scarlet fever in 1923 when she was 6 years old. After that, the house on Henrietta Street grew quieter. His parents stopped speaking about the future in the way they once had. Arthur learned early that silence could be a kind of armor. His grandmother lived 3 streets over, in a cottage that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. She was the one who told him the old stories. Sailors' ghosts walking the abbey steps at midnight. The Barghest, a black dog the size of a calf that appeared on the moors before a death. Shapes moving among the gravestones when the mist rolled in from the water. She never presented these as entertainment, To her, they were warnings, pieces of practical knowledge passed down like recipes or the names of poisonous plants. Arthur listened because everyone did, but he learned early to separate superstition from fact. His way of rebelling against fear was to dissect it. The Barghest became, in his school notebooks, a synthesis of regional folklore, a catalog of recurring motifs. The omen, the liminal space, the price for looking too closely at what should be avoided. By the time he reached 16, he had filled 3 notebooks with cross-referenced entries tracing similar creatures across northern England, Wales, and Scotland. His headmaster, recognizing something more than ordinary curiosity, wrote a letter of recommendation to Cambridge. In October 1935, at 18, Arthur Grayson arrived at Trinity College to read archaeology and anthropology. The transition from Whitby to Cambridge was like stepping into a different century. Gas lamps gave way to electric lights. Fishermen's slang gave way to Latin phrases. But the work itself felt familiar. Under the yellow lamps of college libraries, he traced the same patterns he had seen in his grandmother's stories through Celtic inscriptions, Roman accounts of northern tribes, medieval sermons railing against heathen survivals. To him, the old gods existed only as data points and chiseled marks on stone. By the summer of 1939, he had nearly completed a thesis on ritual boundaries in pre-Roman Britain. His work focused on marginal lands where farmland gave way to moor and bog, where lines on maps meant less than the paths people walked for centuries. The circles of standing stones were, in his view, not just primitive observatories, but markers between the world of the living and the places set aside for the dead. He argued that the rituals performed there were as much about keeping something out as about inviting anything in. His supervisor called the thesis provocative but unsupported. The external examiner called it dangerously speculative. Arthur did not care. He had found something true, even if he could not yet prove it in terms the Academy would accept. The war arrived before anyone could examine his conclusions in detail. Through September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, the quiet rhythms of Cambridge dissolved. Students vanished into training camps. Dons became cipher clerks and intelligence analysts. The neat lines of footnotes and arguments on Arthur's desk suddenly felt irrelevant. He volunteered on 12th of October 1939, 3 weeks after his 22nd birthday. The Army did not care about Celtic ritual theory, but it cared about languages, maps, and the ability to read terrain. Grayson spoke serviceable German and passable French. He could interpret topographic maps and had spent summers walking difficult ground with a surveyor's eye. On 3 January 1940, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry and posted to the 2nd Battalion, part of the British Expeditionary Force preparing to deploy to France. Dunkirk, May-June 1940, was his first education in how fast an entire front could collapse. 9 days of retreat. Smoke and sand and the roar of aircraft. The water slicked with fuel. Bodies rolling in the surf. He remembered standing on the mole at dawn on 1st June, watching the horizon burn, and thinking in a detached, surreal way that this was what the end of the world looked like. Orderly at a distance, chaos up close. He survived the evacuation with a concussion from a near-miss bomb, a scar along his left forearm from shrapnel, and a new understanding. That the distance between order and chaos could be measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. Reports would later dissect the retreat into divisions, brigades, and timings. For the men on the sand, it had been simpler. One moment they held a line. The next, the line dissolved, and they were individuals running for the water. Grayson came home with 23,000 other men who had left equipment, vehicles, and friends on the French coast. He spent the summer of 1940 in England, retraining, absorbing replacements, waiting for the invasion that never came. In his few hours of leave, he returned to Whitby. His father had aged a decade in a year. His grandmother was dying, though she refused to admit it. She held his hand and told him he had the look of someone who had seen a door open that should have stayed shut. He did not ask what she meant. Promoted to full lieutenant on 15th August 1940, Grayson shipped out again, this time to North Africa as part of the 8th Army. Tunisia, 1942-1943. Libya, Egypt. Dust, heat, the weight of equipment cutting into shoulders, the metallic taste of fear at dawn before an advance. In Tunisia, he learned how quickly a tank could appear over a ridge. In the western desert, he learned that mirages were real and that thirst could make a man see things that were not there, or see things that were there but should not have been. Then came Sicily, July 1943, and Italy in the autumn of that year. It was in Italy, near a village called San Pietro in Fine, that Arthur Grayson earned his reputation. 12th of December, 1943. The village sat on high ground overlooking the approach to the monastery at Monte Cassino. German forces held it with 2 companies of infantry, machine gun nests, and pre-sighted mortar positions. The British advance had stalled. 3 previous attempts to take the village had failed, each time with heavy casualties. The problem was not firepower. It was terrain. Every approach was covered. Every route led into interlocking fields of fire. Grayson's company was part of the 4th attempt. His platoon, 26 men, was tasked with a flanking movement along a dry stream bed that wound up the eastern slope. The theory was sound. The stream bed offered cover and concealment. The reality was different. Halfway up, the stream bed narrowed to a rocky defile barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, overlooked by German positions on both sides. The lead section walked into an ambush at 06:47. Machine gun fire cut down 4 men in the first burst. The rest went to ground, pinned in a killing zone with no room to maneuver and no cover worth the name. Mortar rounds began to fall, walking up the stream bed in a methodical pattern. The company commander, a captain named Hendricks, was hit in the first minute. The platoon sergeant took shrapnel to the leg and could not move. Grayson, second in command, found himself in charge of 22 men trapped in a ravine with German guns above them and daylight coming fast. He had 2 options: order a withdrawal, which would mean leaving the wounded and likely losing more men as they retreated through the open ground behind them, or find another way forward. He chose the 3rd option, the one that was not in the manual. For 3 summers before the war, Arthur Grayson had walked the Pennines and the Yorkshire moors with a surveyor's transit, mapping prehistoric sites. He had learned to read ground the way a scholar reads text, looking for patterns, for the logic beneath the surface. A stream bed did not run alone. Water carved multiple channels. If the main route was blocked, there were always smaller veins, cracks in the stone, animal tracks that followed the path of least resistance. He left his second in command, a corporal named Davies, with the main body, and took 3 men. Harris, a runner who could move fast and quiet. Mitchell, who had grown up in the Welsh hills and knew rock, and a lance corporal named Price, who never questioned an order and never hesitated. They moved laterally, not up. Grayson found a narrow fissure in the ravine wall, little more than a vertical crack choked with thorn bushes. It looked impassable. He went up it anyway, using roots and projections, hauling himself hand over hand. The others followed. 30 vertical feet in near silence, thorns tearing uniforms and skin, boots scraping stone. They emerged on a ledge the width of a man's shoulders, running parallel to the stream bed but 15 feet above it. From there, Grayson could see the German machine gun position, a sandbagged nest built into a natural fold in the rock, 2 men visible, a 3rd crouched behind feeding belts. He had 1 chance. The Germans were focused downward, pouring fire into the stream bed. They had not posted sentries on the approach from above because the cliff face looked unclimbable. Grayson and his 3 men crawled along the ledge, moving with the kind of concentration that turned seconds into hours. 50 feet, 40, 30. Close enough to hear the Germans talking, to smell the burnt powder and cigarette smoke. At 20 feet, Grayson stopped. He had 2 grenades. Harris had 2. Mitchell and Price carried rifles and fixed bayonets. The plan was simple because there was no time for complexity. Grenades first, rifles second, rush the position before they could recover. At 07:03, 16 minutes after the ambush began, Grayson pulled the pin on his first grenade, counted 2 seconds, and threw. The explosion was muffled by the sandbags, but devastating within the confined space. Harris's grenade followed 3 seconds later. Before the smoke cleared, all 4 men were over the lip of the position, rifles raised. 2 Germans were dead. 1 was wounded, staring up at them in shock. Grayson did not give him time to recover. He turned the captured machine gun around, sighted on the second German position 30 yards to the south, and opened fire. The effect was immediate. The Germans, suddenly taking fire from their own flank, broke. Within minutes, the rest of Grayson's platoon was moving up the streambed, no longer pinned. Within an hour, they had cleared the eastern approach to San Pietro. The village fell that afternoon. Casualty count: 4 dead, 6 wounded, all in the initial ambush. 0 losses after Grayson's flanking move. He was mentioned in dispatches and promoted to acting captain on 20th December 1943. His company commander, recovering in a field hospital, wrote in his report, "Like Grayson displayed exceptional initiative and tactical awareness. His ability to read ground under fire is the best I have seen." What the report did not mention, because there was no space in military language for it, was the other thing Grayson had noticed on that ledge above San Pietro. Carved into the rock face, half hidden by lichen and erosion, was a symbol. Not recent, not medieval, older. 3 interlocking spirals, the kind he had seen in his thesis research, the kind associated with Celtic ritual sites and boundary markers. He had stood there for 5 seconds, staring at it, while gunfire echoed below and Harris hissed at him to move. Later, he told himself it was coincidence. Italy was full of old carvings. The symbol meant nothing. But the doubt stayed with him. Through the rest of the Italian campaign, through the grinding months at Cassino, through the slow advance north, the part of his mind that had once catalogued myths continued to work quietly in the background. Trenches were not so different from the ditches and pits he had studied in archaeological reports. The way men avoided certain sections of ground after a particularly bad night of bombardment felt like the instinct that made older communities declare some groves forbidden. Places accrued weight, reputation. Stories grew quickly in the dark, especially when rifles fell silent and there was nothing to distract from what the imagination could supply. By the autumn of 1944, after 4 years of fighting across 3 theaters, Arthur Grayson was no longer the scholar who had left Cambridge. The Army had worn some edges off him and sharpened others. He had become, in the language of official reports, steady under fire and reliable in command of small units. He was 27 years old, lean and weathered, with a scar along his forearm and another across his ribs from a piece of shrapnel that had missed his lung by 2 inches. He carried a service revolver, a folding map case, a notebook, and a photograph of his parents taken in 1938, before his father's hair had gone white. His men trusted him because he had not yet lost anyone under his direct command in circumstances that could be traced to poor decisions. That record was an entry in an invisible ledger he kept in the privacy of his own thoughts. Men sent out, men brought back, men who had disappeared between one line on a map and the next. The account between him and the war, so far, was unbalanced in his favor. He knew it could not last. When British intelligence began to pick through intercepted German communications in October 1944, his name appeared in margin notes before it appeared on any formal order. The messages were fragmentary, heavy with code words. Heritage units, special research detachments, secured artifacts. To most officers, it was noise. To Grayson's trained eye, it looked like the academic shorthand he had seen in pre-war German publications on mythology and prehistory, now mixed with military terminology. The organization behind those messages was the Ahnenerbe, the SS Ancestral Heritage Society. Before the war, its members had written papers on runes and sagas. During the war, they had persuaded Hitler that the past could be mined like ore for weapons. Lines had been crossed that no university ethics committee could have anticipated. In October 1944, reports reached London that a small German party had infiltrated the Devon coast. Their equipment did not match that of ordinary saboteurs. Survey instruments, crates marked as geological samples, references to coordinates that matched old archaeological notations describing ancient circles and heathen stones on Exmoor. Grayson found himself summoned to a briefing in a windowless room that smelled of tobacco and damp paper. On the table were maps of Exmoor layered with older boundaries, Roman roads, Bronze Age barrows. Folklore collections lay open, marked where tales of cursed bogs overlapped with German grid references. Intercepts mentioned a threshold, a sealed place, a ritual observation. For the staff officers, it was one more complication. For Grayson, it was a line drawn directly from his thesis to the present. The orders were brief. Take a patrol. Confirm or deny German presence. Prevent whatever they were attempting. On 3rd November 1944, at 19:30, Grayson's truck left the last proper road and climbed onto the narrow lane threading into Exmoor. 8 men in the back, stars visible through broken cloud, engine noise bouncing off stone walls, then fading into open ground. By 23 wows, the fog had come. By 23:11, one man was gone. By midnight, Arthur Grayson stood in front of figures in German uniforms with faces that were not faces, and understood that the line his thesis had described, the boundary between the living world and the places set aside for the dead, was not metaphorical. It was here. It was open. And he was standing on the wrong side of it. 3rd November 1944, 23:17. Exmoor Moors, Devonshire, England. The figures in German uniforms did not move. 12 of them, Grayson counted, standing in a precise semicircle exactly 8 paces apart. The mathematics of their positioning was too perfect, too deliberate. No patrol formed up like that. No ambush. This was geometry, not tactics. His rifle was still raised, fingers still on the useless trigger. He lowered it slowly, muscles protesting the shift in weight. The Lee Enfield weighed 9 pounds 4 ounces. He had carried it across 3 campaigns. Tonight it felt like stage property, metal shaped into the memory of a weapon with none of its function. Harris stood to his left, breathing fast and shallow, each exhale visible as a pale cloud in the freezing air. Temperature had dropped. Grayson estimated 38 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe lower. His fingers, wrapped around the rifle stock, had gone numb at the tips. James, the radio operator, had set down the useless transmitter. Its weight had left deep red grooves across his shoulders, visible even through the wool uniform. He had drawn his Webley revolver, a .38 caliber weapon standard issue for support personnel. His hand shook badly enough that the barrel traced small circles in the air. Parker, the medic, had not moved since the figures appeared. He stood frozen, staring, his medical kit hanging forgotten at his side. His lips moved without sound, forming words Grayson could not hear but could guess. Prayers, probably, or the names of saints his mother had taught him. The 5th soldier, Corporal Bennett, a replacement who had joined the unit 3 weeks ago, had taken 2 steps backward and stopped only when the truck's rear bumper pressed against his legs. His face was white, eyes wide, the expression of a man who had run out of rational explanations and was now simply enduring. Grayson's training demanded assessment. 4 of the figures carried rifles, slung across their backs in the standard German manner. 2 others had what looked like MP-40 submachine guns, though the details blurred at the edges. The rest were unarmed, or appeared to be. The distance between Grayson's position and the nearest figure, approximately 27 feet. Too far for a bayonet charge. Close enough to hit with a grenade if grenades worked any better than bullets. But none of that mattered if the rules had changed. The figure directly ahead, centered in the arc, stepped forward. 9 feet now. Close enough that Grayson could see the texture of its uniform. Genuine Feldgrau wool, buttons tarnished, collar tabs indicating here infantry, not SS. Mud caked the boots in layers, dried and then re-wetted, suggesting days of movement across difficult ground. Close enough to smell it. Earth, peat, decay. Not the sharp, immediate stench of recent death, but something older, deeper. the smell of things buried and then unearthed. The figure stopped, raised its head. The helmet rim no longer shadowed the face. Grayson's breath caught. The skin was translucent, stretched tight over bone, with a waxy quality like old parchment soaked in oil. The cheekbones stood out sharply. The lips had pulled back from the teeth, which were intact but discolored, gray-yellow. The eyes were the worst. Not empty sockets, but present, visible. Yet they reflected no light. They absorbed it. 2 black holes in a gray face, drawing in the lantern glow and giving nothing back. The mouth opened. The jaw hinged downward with a faint wet sound, gristle moving over bone. A voice emerged, not from the throat, but from everywhere at once, pressing against Grayson's ears like water pressure. German words, clear and precise, southern accent, possibly Bavarian. The figure informed him that this was not British territory in any sense that mattered. The lines drawn on maps held no authority here. This place existed outside such boundaries. Behind Grayson, Harris made a questioning sound, not understanding the German. Grayson raised one hand without looking back, a gesture that meant wait, hold position. Not now. The figure's head tilted. The motion went too far, 30 degrees past where a human neck would stop, as if the bones had become soft. It continued speaking in that flat, emotionless voice. It explained that what stood before them were remains, things that had been sealed beneath this ground for 2,000 years, released 6 days ago by men in black uniforms who believed they could command what lay beyond. Grayson's mind, even in shock, continued to catalog details. The figure's hands hung at its sides, but the fingers did not quite align properly. The left hand had 6 fingers, or perhaps the middle finger had split partway down, creating a forked digit. The right hand looked normal from a distance, but on closer inspection seemed to have too many knuckles. While he was processing this, Parker made a sound. A high, thin whine, the noise a dog makes when it has been hurt but does not know where to run. Grayson ordered him steady without turning, told him to keep eyes front, stay focused. The figure's head rotated toward Parker. Its gaze, if something with light-absorbing eyes could be said to gaze, fixed on the medic. Parker's whine cut off abruptly. His breathing stopped. For 3 seconds he stood perfectly still, not even blinking. Then he screamed. Not words, not a cry for help. Just sound, raw and animal, torn from a throat that had forgotten language. He dropped his medical kit, turned, and ran into the fog. Harris shouted Parker's name, starting after him. Grayson's voice cracked like a whip, ordering him to hold position. Harris froze mid-step, torn between discipline and instinct. The figure watched Parker disappear into the white. It did not pursue. After 5 seconds, the screaming stopped. Not fading with distance, just stopping, cut off mid-note like a radio switched off. Grayson counted the remaining men. 4, including himself. 2 lost now. Thomas, who had vanished during the perimeter check, and Parker, who had just run into the fog. The invisible ledger in his mind, the account between him and the war, shifted heavily toward the red. He demanded to know what the figure had done to Parker. The response came in that same flat voice. Nothing had been done. Parker had looked. He had seen what these things were beneath the borrowed flesh. His mind could not hold the image. It had broken. Grayson felt ice in his chest, spreading outward. If simply looking at these things could shatter sanity, then every second they stood here was a risk. But running had not saved Parker. Standing might not save them either. The only option left was forward. He asked what these things were. The answer came. They were what remained when the living became something else, when flesh was abandoned but will persisted, when the boundary between death and undeath became negotiable. The Druids had known. They had marked places where the living world ended, and the other began with stone circles, ditches, words carved into rock. They had performed rituals to keep the barrier strong. For 2,000 years it had held. Then 6 days ago, men from the SS Ahnenerbe had come to this moor. They had brought survey equipment, books stolen from archives across occupied Europe, knowledge extracted from temples and tombs. They had found the sealed place. They had performed a counter-ritual, a reversal. They had opened what had been closed. The figure's mouth moved in what might have been a smile, lips pulling back to reveal gray gums. The Germans, it explained, had believed they could command what lay beyond the threshold. They had believed they could turn the dead into weapons, into servants, into an army that required neither food nor sleep nor loyalty beyond compulsion. They had been wrong. What came through did not serve. It hungered. And now the door stood open, and those who had waited in the spaces between could walk again. Grayson asked where the Germans were now. The figure gestured vaguely toward the fog-shrouded moor beyond. They rested in the circle where they had worked, it said. What remained of them? Their souls had been consumed by what they summoned. Their bodies were empty vessels. Some of the returned wore them now because it was easier to move in this world when clothed in flesh, even borrowed flesh. The figure tilted its head in what might have been curiosity. It made an offer. The threshold wobbled, half open, unstable. It required more. The ritual the Germans had begun needed completion. 12 lives given willingly would seal it from the inside, bind what had been released, restore the balance. If Grayson and his men walked into the circle and accepted death, their sacrifice would serve a purpose. The moor would be safe again. The war could continue elsewhere, uncontaminated by what had been released here. The mathematics were clear. 6 men against an unknown but potentially vast number of future casualties. 6 names against a spreading contamination that might, if left unchecked, turn the entire moor into a dead zone within months or years. Grayson had made harder calculations before. War was built on them. Send this platoon to hold a bridge so the battalion can escape. Call artillery on a position even though your own men are still inside the kill radius. Sacrifice the few to save the many. But those calculations assumed an enemy that followed rules, a cause that justified the cost. This was different. The thing in front of him was not an enemy in any meaningful sense. It was a force, like weather or disease, indifferent to allegiance or morality. And more than that, accepting the offer would set a precedent. It would confirm that when faced with the supernatural, with forces beyond understanding, the correct response was surrender. It would validate the idea that some problems could only be solved by feeding them bodies. Leonard Funk, outnumbered 90-1 with a submachine gun pressed to his stomach, had laughed instead of surrendering. Not because the mathematics made sense, not because he had a brilliant plan, but because something deeper than mathematics had told him the only way forward was through refusal, through the sheer bloody-minded insistence that the impossible answer was not the only answer. Grayson made his decision. He refused. He stated it clearly, without room for misinterpretation. His patrol would not walk into the circle. They would not close the threshold by volunteering to die. If the things wanted 6 more dead, they would have to take them by force. Behind him, Harris exhaled sharply. Whether in relief or terror, Grayson could not tell. James shifted his weight, gripping his revolver tighter. Bennett remained silent, but his breathing had steadied slightly. The figure studied Grayson with what might have been curiosity, or might have been nothing at all. It informed him of the consequences. They would walk the moor until they died. The fog would not lift. The compass would not guide them. Their weapons would not fire. They would become lost, and when they were weak enough, the hunger would take them. It would be slower than the offering, more painful, but the result would be the same. Grayson countered. He pointed out that the figure had mentioned books, tools, knowledge. The Germans had brought equipment, had performed a ritual. That meant there was a process, a sequence, a methodology. If the threshold could be opened, it could be closed. Perhaps by different means, perhaps without requiring 6 willing sacrifices. He asked where the German equipment was now. The figure did not answer. Its silence was answer enough. Grayson felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, or might have been the kind of desperate clarity that comes when all options are bad and action becomes the only antidote to paralysis. He turned to address his men, keeping his voice low and steady. New orders. They would find the German camp. They would find whatever the SS had used to open the threshold. And they would find a way to close it that did not involve volunteering to be ritual sacrifices. Harris asked the obvious question. How did they find a camp in fog this dense when they could barely see 10 feet? Grayson looked back at the figure in the German uniform, still standing 9 feet away, silent and watching. His answer was simple. They would follow the dead. The figure's head tilted one final time. Then, without further communication, it turned and began to walk back into the fog. The other shapes followed, moving in that same smooth, wrong rhythm, feet not quite touching the ground properly. Within seconds, they had dissolved into the white. Grayson gave them a 5 count. His watch read 23:21. He issued instructions. Stay within arm's reach of the man ahead. Do not look directly at the faces. Keep eyes on backs and boots and equipment. And if anyone felt their minds starting to slip, if they saw things that defied comprehension, they were to speak immediately. Bennett would take rear guard. Harris would walk middle position. James would follow directly behind Grayson. They moved forward into the fog, following shapes that should not exist. 23:34. 13 minutes of walking. The ground beneath their boots had changed. Solid earth gave way to softer peat, water seeping up with each step, soaking through leather. Twice Bennett's foot broke through into hidden pockets, plunging knee-deep before Grayson and Harris hauled him out. The cold was getting worse. Grayson's estimate, 34 degrees Fahrenheit now, dropping toward freezing. The figures ahead moved without sound. No footsteps, no breathing. They glided through the fog like images projected onto a screen, two-dimensional shapes pretending to be solid. James made a sound behind Grayson. Not words, just a noise of realization or alarm. Grayson stopped, raising his hand. The column halted. James gestured to the radio still strapped to his back, to the headphones hanging around his neck. Grayson took the headphones, placed them over his ears. The radio, dead for the past hour, now transmitted sound. Not static. Voices. They came in layers, overlapping, speaking languages he half recognized. German, yes, but also others. Latin, something older, harsher, pre-Roman Celtic, perhaps. And beneath them all, a low, continuous tone like the hum of high-voltage wires, vibrating at the edge of hearing. Words emerged occasionally from the chaos. Fragments, warnings. A woman's voice speaking Old English, or something close to it, repeating the same phrase over and over. Flee the circle, flee the stones. The threshold devours the willing and the lost. A child's voice, gender indeterminate, singing in Latin. Mors certa, hora incerta. Death is certain, its hour is not. Grayson pulled the headphones off, handed them back to James with instructions to continue monitoring. If anything clear came through, anything they could use, he was to report immediately. They resumed walking. The fog ahead began to thin. Not dispersing, but pulling back, retreating into itself like a curtain drawn aside. Light appeared. Not lantern light. This was colder, greenish-white, with an unhealthy quality like phosphorescence on rotting wood or the glow of certain deep-sea creatures hauled up from abyssal depths. The figures stopped, stepped aside, forming two lines like an honor guard. Between them, illuminated by that corpse light, was the German camp. 23:47. 6 tents, standard Wehrmacht field pattern, arranged in a textbook defensive perimeter. An Opel Blitz 3-ton lorry sat parked at the center, its canvas cover intact but sagging under accumulated moisture. Equipment lay scattered across the ground, surveying instruments, theodolites, and compasses, wooden crates with SS markings, map cases, a radio set more sophisticated than anything Grayson's unit carried, and stranger items, brass instruments whose purpose was unclear, leather-bound books stacked in careful piles, jars containing what might have been soil or ash or something worse. And bodies. 6 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around a pit carved into the peat. They were not simply dead. They had been positioned with deliberate care, faces turned inward, hands placed palm down on the ground as if pushing against the earth. Each wore the black uniform of the SS, though the fabric was torn and stained with mud and darker substances. Grayson approached slowly, every sense screaming warnings his training could not classify. The smell hit him at 6 paces. Decomposition, copper-sharp blood, human waste, and underneath it all something sweet and nauseating like flowers left too long in a sealed room, like fruit rotting from the inside out. The pit at the center was perhaps 8 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, its edges so precise they looked machine-cut rather than hand-dug. The walls were smooth as worked stone. At the bottom, maybe 12 feet down, Grayson could see the reason for everything. Ancient stones, pale limestone or chalk, weathered by more than weather, covered in carvings that hurt to look at directly. One stone stood upright in the center, a pillar or marker 3 feet tall, inscribed with spirals and lines that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. The triple spiral, Triskelion, a Celtic symbol he had catalogued in his thesis research. He had argued it marked thresholds that were not metaphorical, but functional, boundaries between the world of the living and places set aside for forces that were neither alive nor properly dead. He had been right. The knowledge brought no satisfaction. Bennett pointed at one of the bodies without speaking, his finger shaking. Grayson looked. The dead SS man's face was wrong in a way that made the figures in gray uniforms seem almost normal by comparison. The skin had split, pulled back from bone, but not through natural decay. Through transformation. The skull beneath had been reshaped, the jaw extended too far forward, the teeth multiplied into rows like a shark's. The eye sockets had migrated higher and wider on the skull. Whatever this man had seen or touched or summoned in his last moments had begun to change him from the inside out, restructuring bone and tissue according to rules that human biology did not follow. Harris made a strangled sound behind Grayson. Bennett turned away, bent double, and vomited onto the peat. Grayson forced himself to look away from the bodies, to scan the camp with tactical precision. There, a tent larger than the others, German military markings on the canvas. Command tent. He moved toward it, gesturing for the others to maintain positions and watch the perimeter. The interior was chaos barely contained by military discipline. Papers scattered across a folding table, held down by rocks and spent shell casings. Books, dozens of them, stacked and open to marked pages. Photographs pinned to corkboards showed stone circles from across Europe. Stonehenge, Avebury, Karnak, sites in Germany and Poland and Norway. Maps layered over maps, showing ancient boundaries, Roman roads, Celtic territories, and newer annotations in German script indicating survey results and measurements. In the center of it all, left open on the table as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence, lay a journal. Leather-bound, good quality, the kind issued to SS officers for operational reports. The handwriting was precise and controlled for the first 100 pages, degrading into shaking scrawls toward the end. Grayson read the final entries, translating the German as his eyes moved across the page. 3rd November 1944, 18 Sal. The ritual is complete. 15 hours of preparation, 3 hours of execution, following the sequence exactly as reconstructed from the texts recovered in Toulouse and Prague. The seal has been broken. The threshold opens. I can hear them now, voices from beneath, from the spaces between worlds. Miller says we should leave immediately and call for extraction. He is correct. But Obersturmführer Schaefer insists we document everything, that Berlin expects detailed records. He does not understand. None of them understand what we have done. 1930. They are coming through, not all at once. Slowly, testing the opening, learning our shapes. Richter is dead. He looked into the pit to photograph the exposed stones. Something looked back. When he turned away, his face had begun to change. Within minutes, he was unrecognizable. We shot him. It made no difference. He continued moving until Miller used a shovel to... God. His face. Even dead, it kept changing. 2015. 3 dead now. The fog has come, thicker than any natural weather. We cannot leave. The vehicles will not start. The radios transmit only voices in languages none of us recognize. The voices say we can close the threshold, seal it again, if we give blood willingly. 6 offerings to match the 6 stones of the inner circle. I do not want to die, but staying alive may be worse. 21 Samsorm. Schaefer has gone mad. He believes he can negotiate with them, that our status as SS guarantees us authority even here. He walked into the fog calling for them to present themselves for questioning. We heard him screaming for 11 minutes before the sound stopped. 22:30. Only I remain. The others are arranged around the pit as instructed. Willing sacrifice, they said, would close the door. They lied. We gave 6, and it was not enough. Or perhaps they told the truth, and willingness matters more than we understood. My companions died afraid, fighting, trying to escape even as they accepted the knife. That is not willing. That is coerced. The writing became illegible after that, degrading into scratches and symbols that might have been letters or might have been something else. The final legible words, written in a hand shaking so badly the pen had torn the paper, read, "It is not closed. I have failed. God forgive me. I have opened a door that should have stayed shut until the end of the world. If anyone finds this..." The sentence ended mid-word. Grayson stood in the tent, journal in his hands, listening to the silence outside. The SS had tried to close the threshold. They had failed because their sacrifice, extracted under duress and terror, had not met whatever requirements the ritual demanded. Willingness was not just agreement. It was acceptance without reservation, without the animal panic that made humans fight against death even when they claimed to embrace it, which meant the same trap awaited him and his men if they tried the same solution. He set the journal down and searched the rest of the tent systematically. There, a wooden crate, lid pried open, packing straw spilling out. Inside were books, old books, the kind that belonged in museums behind glass. He lifted one carefully. The binding was medieval, maybe older, leather over boards, the pages vellum. The text was Latin mixed with older scripts he recognized from his research. Ogham, the Celtic tree alphabet, and runic characters. He could not read it fully. His Latin was serviceable, but these were technical texts, ritual instructions, sequences of actions and words that required specialized knowledge. But one phrase appeared repeatedly, marked in the margins in what looked like recent pencil. Sanguis offert, sed mens, claudit. Blood offers, but mind closes. Blood was part of it, yes. But blood alone was insufficient. The threshold responded to consciousness, to will, to something the text called consensus animarum, the agreement of souls, which raised a question. Whose souls? The sacrifices? The ones performing the ritual? Or something else, something already present in this place? A sound outside the tent. Grayson dropped the book and drew his revolver in one motion, the weapon sliding into his hand with the smooth automation of long practice. He moved to the tent flap, peered out. The figures in German uniforms stood in a ring around the camp, motionless, watching. His 3 men, Harris, James, Bennett, had drawn together near the truck, back to back, weapons raised. The standoff had a fragile quality, like glass under pressure, waiting for the first crack. Grayson stepped out of the tent. All heads turned toward him. He crossed the open ground to his men, moving deliberately, not running, but not dawdling. He positioned himself with them, completing the circle so all 4 stood with clear fields of vision. He explained what he had found in low, rapid sentences. The Germans had opened the threshold with a ritual. They had tried to close it with sacrifice. They had failed because their deaths, taken unwillingly despite verbal agreement, did not satisfy the requirements. The books in the command tent suggested an alternative approach. Not blood alone, but consciousness, focused will, some kind of mental or spiritual consensus, which meant they needed to understand what the threshold actually was, how it functioned, what laws governed it, and they needed to do so before the cold and exhaustion made thinking impossible, before the creeping horror wore down their minds the way it had worn down Parker's. Harris asked the only question that mattered. How much time did they have? Grayson checked his watch. 23:53. Dawn would come around 07:15, roughly 7 hours away. The figure had said nothing about time limits, but the German journal mentioned that the ritual was tied to lunar phases and planetary positions. Tonight was the new moon, the darkest night of the month. Tomorrow would be different. Whether better or worse, he could not say. 7 hours to understand a 2,000-year-old ritual, decode texts written in dead languages, and find a way to close a door between worlds using nothing but 4 exhausted soldiers, limited ammunition, and a will to survive that was already fraying at the edges. Leonard Funk had faced 90 Germans with a submachine gun and 60 seconds of controlled chaos. Grayson had 4 men, 7 hours, and a problem that bullets could not solve. The arithmetic was not in his favor, but arithmetic, as Funk had proven, was not always the deciding factor. Grayson told his men to gather anything useful from the German camp. Rations, dry clothing, the books and papers from the command tent, any equipment that might serve a purpose not yet clear. They would withdraw to a defensible position, somewhere with clear sightlines and solid ground, and they would work the problem methodically. Because the alternative, accepting death or waiting for something worse, was not acceptable. The figures in gray uniforms watched them work. They did not interfere. They simply stood, patient as stone, waiting for time or exhaustion or despair to do what force could not. They had withdrawn 200 yards from the German camp to higher ground where the peak gave way to exposed rock. A natural formation, granite pushing through softer earth, creating a platform roughly 15 feet across. Defensible. Solid. The kind of ground that gave tactical advantage in any normal engagement. Tonight, tactical advantage meant nothing, but having their backs to stone instead of fog felt better anyway. Grayson had spread the German materials across the rock. 3 books, the journal, loose papers covered in diagrams and calculations, a brass instrument that might have been an astrolabe or might have been something else, and 2 items that defied immediate classification. A wooden box containing what looked like carved bone fragments, and a glass vial holding liquid that glowed faintly in the dark. His watch read 0047, 6 hours and 28 minutes until dawn. The fog had not lifted. The figures in gray uniforms stood at the edge of visibility, a loose ring around their position, neither advancing nor retreating. Watching. Waiting. Harris and Bennett stood guard, one facing north, one south, rifles ready, but no longer raised. The weapons would not fire. They all knew that now, but holding them provided the illusion of control, and illusion was better than nothing. James sat with his back against the rock, the radio headphones over his ears, his face pale and drawn in the greenish corpse light that somehow penetrated even this far from the German camp. Grayson worked through the texts systematically, forcing his exhausted mind to focus. The largest book was medieval, possibly 13th century, written by a monk who had documented pre-Christian sites across Britain. The Latin was dense, technical, filled with ecclesiastical terminology wrapped around older pagan concepts. The monk had been trying to understand what he called loca damnata, cursed places, where the boundary between the world of the living and altera pars, the other side, grew thin. The second book was newer, 18th century, German, part of the early Romantic fascination with folk traditions and mythology. It contained transcriptions of Celtic ritual texts, many of them fragmentary, reconstructed from scattered sources. One section dealt specifically with threshold sites, places marked by stone circles where the Druids had performed ceremonies to vincere portus, bind the gates. The third book was the most recent and the most disturbing. Published in 1938 by the Ahnenerbe, stamped with SS insignia, it synthesized the previous scholarship into practical instructions. The author, an Obersturmbannführer whose name Grayson did not recognize, had approached the subject not as history, but as engineering. The threshold sites were not metaphors or superstitions. They were functional mechanisms, technological artifacts from a civilization that had understood principles modern science had not yet rediscovered. The book included diagrams, technical drawings showing the arrangement of stones, the alignment to celestial bodies, the precise measurements and angles. It included equations, attempting to express in mathematical terms what the Druids had expressed in ritual. And it included instructions for opening a sealed threshold, step by step, with the clinical precision of a field manual. What it did not include was comprehensive instructions for closing one. Grayson read that section 3 times, translating the German carefully, making notes on blank pages torn from the journal. The text acknowledged that closure rituals existed, but claimed they were fragmentary, incomplete, lost to time. The best the author could offer were theories, educated guesses based on parallel traditions and structural analysis of the ritual framework. The core principle seemed clear. Opening required force, the breaking of a seal through concentrated will and offering. Closing required the opposite, not force, but harmony, not breaking, but mending. The German text used the word Einverständnis, agreement or consensus. Not just human agreement, but agreement between 3 elements: the living who performed the ritual, the dead who inhabited the threshold space, and the structure itself, the stones, the earth, the accumulated weight of 2 millennia of sealed power, which meant Grayson needed to negotiate, not with the figures in gray uniforms who were symptoms rather than cause, but with something deeper, older, less human: the threshold itself. He set the book down and looked at the brass instrument. Upon closer inspection, it was indeed an astrolabe, but modified. Additional rings had been added, inscribed with symbols he recognized from his thesis research. The Wheel of the Year, the Celtic seasonal divisions, alignments marking sunrise and sunset at solstices and equinoxes. A tool for calculating not just position in space, but position in time, in the cyclical rhythms that pre-Christian cultures had considered more fundamental than linear chronology. He checked the current configuration, rotating the rings carefully. New moon. 3 days past Samhain, the Celtic New Year, the time when the boundary between worlds traditionally opened. The Germans had chosen their timing well, or had been advised to. The natural cycle of the year had made the threshold vulnerable, and they had exploited that vulnerability. Which suggested a question. If the cycle had made opening easier, would it also affect closure? And if so, how long did the window remain? Grayson consulted the German book again, cross-referencing with the older texts. The answer emerged slowly, pieced together from fragmentary sources. The threshold, once opened at the dark moon, would remain most unstable for 3 days. After that, the natural cycle would begin to reassert itself, the barrier strengthening of its own accord. But full closure required active intervention. Without it, the threshold would settle into a new equilibrium, partially open, a permanent wound, bleeding supernatural contamination into the surrounding area. 3 days. The Germans had opened it 6 days ago, on 29 October. Today was 4 November. The window had closed. The threshold had already begun to stabilize in its compromised state, which meant conventional closure was no longer possible. Grayson sat back against the stone, feeling the cold seep through his uniform, into his bones. The exhaustion he had been holding at bay pressed down on him with physical weight. His eyes burned. His hands shook slightly, whether from cold or fatigue he could not tell. The wound on his forearm, the scar from Dunkirk 4 years ago, ached with phantom pain. He had faced impossible situations before. At San Pietro, trapped in a ravine with German guns above and time running out, he had found the third option, the route that should not have existed. But this was different. This was not a tactical problem with a tactical solution. This was something older and stranger, operating under rules he only half understood. Harris called softly from his position. Movement in the fog. Grayson looked up. The figures had shifted, drawing closer, tightening the ring. Still not attacking, but the message was clear. Time was running out in ways that had nothing to do with dawn. James pulled the headphones off and turned to face Grayson. His expression was strange, caught between terror and something else, something that might have been understanding, or might have been the first stages of madness. He reported what he had heard through the static. The voices on the radio had become clearer, more distinct. They were not random. They were responding, answering questions James had not asked aloud but had thought while listening. One voice in particular, speaking in accented English, had identified itself. Müller, it said. Hauptmann Müller, the second in command of the German research team. Dead 6 days, but still present, still conscious in whatever passed for awareness on the other side of the threshold. Müller had explained what James needed to know. The threshold could not be closed from outside, not anymore, not after the stabilization window had passed. It could only be closed from within. Someone would need to cross over, enter the space between worlds where the mechanism existed in its true form, and seal it manually. The Druids had built fail-safes, emergency measures for exactly this situation, but activating them required presence, physical and conscious presence, on both sides of the boundary simultaneously, which meant splitting a living human consciousness across the threshold, sending part of oneself through while keeping part anchored in the living world. The medieval monk had called it dissociatio animae, the separation of the soul. The Germans had called it Bewusstseinsspaltung, consciousness splitting. Both terms meant the same thing, a process that would almost certainly destroy the person attempting it. Müller, speaking through the corrupted radio from whatever remained of his existence, had been apologetic. He had not wanted this. None of them had. They had been following orders, pursuing academic recognition, believing the SS promises that Germany needed every advantage, conventional or otherwise. They had opened a door they should have left sealed, and now someone would have to pay the price to close it. James finished his report and waited. Around them, the fog pressed closer. The temperature had dropped further. Grayson estimated 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. His breath came in clouds. Ice crystals formed on metal surfaces, on the brass astrolabe, on the barrels of useless rifles. Grayson did the mathematics one more time, searching for alternatives, for the hidden third option. 1. Attempt the closure ritual as described, accepting probable death or worse. 2. Abandon the attempt, withdraw if withdrawal was even possible, and leave the threshold permanently compromised. 3. Find another way, some variation on the procedure that reduced the cost. He could not find a third option. Leonard Funk, facing 90 armed Germans with a submachine gun pressed to his stomach, had not found a third option either. The mathematics had been impossible. The sensible choice had been surrender. But Funk had refused to accept that those were the only choices. He had laughed in the face of certainty and then acted, violently and immediately, creating chaos where order had seemed absolute. Grayson could not create chaos here. The situation was too delicate, the forces involved too powerful. But he could do what Funk had done in essence. Refused to accept that surrender was the only rational choice. He stood gathering the books and papers, organizing them into a sequence. He explained to his 3 remaining men what needed to be done, speaking quietly and clearly, laying out the procedure as he understood it from the texts and from Miller's message through the radio. They would return to the pit, to the exposed stones at the center of the threshold. Grayson would perform the closure ritual using the instructions pieced together from 3 sources spanning 2 millennia. The ritual required blood, yes, but not as sacrifice, as signature, as identification, as proof that a living will stood behind the words. It required consciousness focused through the barrier, one part here and one part there, holding both sides simultaneously until the seal reformed. It would probably kill him. The texts were clear about that, or as clear as fragmentary historical sources could be. The human mind was not designed to exist in two places at once. The strain would be immense. Most who attempted such procedures died immediately. Some survived long enough to complete the work before dying. A very few, according to legend, returned intact but changed, never entirely present again, always slightly displaced from the world around them. Harris asked the obvious question: why did it have to be Grayson? Why not one of them, or all of them together, sharing the burden? Grayson's answer was simple. He was the only one who had spent years studying these sites, reading the source material, developing the mental framework to comprehend what the Druids had been doing. The ritual required understanding, not just performance. It required someone who could hold the concept of a threshold in their mind clearly enough to manipulate it. The others lacked that preparation. Attempting the procedure would kill them without accomplishing the goal. It was not heroism. It was specialization. He was the only tool available for this specific task. Bennett, who had been silent for most of the night, spoke for the first time in hours. He asked about afterward. If Grayson succeeded, if the threshold closed, would they be able to leave? Would the fog lift? Would the compass work again? Grayson admitted he did not know. The text suggested that closure would restore normal conditions immediately, but the texts had been written by people who had never actually performed an emergency closure under these circumstances. Theory and practice might differ significantly. James asked a harder question. What happened if Grayson failed partway through? If he died before completing the sequence? Again, Grayson did not know. Possibly nothing. Possibly something worse than the current situation. The threshold might destabilize further, might expand. The contamination might accelerate. Or it might simply remain as it was, a permanent wound, and 3 soldiers would be stranded on a cursed moor with their officer dead and no way to complete what he had started. He was not asking them to accept the plan. He was informing them of what he intended to do. They could stay and assist, holding the perimeter while he worked. Or they could withdraw now, while withdrawal might still be possible, and report to command. Let someone else deal with the aftermath. Bring specialists, clergy, scientists, whoever the army thought appropriate for a supernatural crisis. Harris answered for all of them. They would stay. Not because it made sense, not because the odds were acceptable, but because leaving would mean abandoning their commanding officer in a place where even the definitions of life and death had become negotiable. That was not something they could do and still call themselves soldiers afterward. Grayson nodded once, accepting the decision. He checked his watch. 1:23. 6 hours and 12 minutes until dawn. Time to move. They descended from the rock platform, moving back toward the German camp in single file. The figures in gray uniforms parted before them, forming a corridor through the fog. No resistance. No threat. Just patient observation, as if outcome had already been determined and action was merely formality. Cell 147. The pit at the center of the threshold. Grayson knelt on the peat at the edge, looking down at the exposed stones 12 feet below. The corpse light emanating from the carvings was brighter now, or perhaps his eyes had adjusted. He could see individual symbols clearly. The triple spiral at the center, surrounded by rings of Ogham script and geometric patterns that shifted slightly when viewed peripherally, never quite stable. He had arranged the necessary materials in sequence. The books open to relevant pages, the astrolabe positioned to mark current time and position, the glass vial containing glowing liquid, the bone fragments from the wooden box. Harris, James, and Bennett stood at 3 points around the circle, forming a triangle, weapons discarded, hands empty. Their role was not to fight, but to anchor, to provide living presence as counterweight to what Grayson was about to attempt. The figures had withdrawn to the edge of the camp, watching from a distance. Grayson had the distinct sense they were waiting not with hostility, but with something closer to curiosity, perhaps even hope. Whatever they had become after death, trapped between worlds, they wanted this resolved as much as he did. He reviewed the procedure one final time, fixing each step in memory. First, blood offering, not as sacrifice, but as identification. Second, invocation, speaking the words in the old language, calling to the structure itself rather than to any entity. Third, the separation, the dangerous part, pushing consciousness through the barrier while maintaining connection to the body. Fourth, the sealing, if he survived that long, using focused will to reform the broken binding. Fifth, return, if return was possible. Grayson drew his service knife, a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife issued to officers, 7 inches of double-edged steel. He cut his left palm, a clean slice across the lifeline, deep enough to bleed freely. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, grounding him in physical reality. Blood welled up, dark in the green light. He let it drip onto the nearest stone at the pit's edge, watching it spread across weathered limestone, soaking into cracks and carvings. The stone seemed to drink it, pulling the blood inward faster than simple absorption would explain. He spoke the invocation, reading phonetically from the medieval text, words in a language dead for 1,500 years. The sounds felt wrong in his mouth, consonants formed too far back in the throat, vowels shaped differently than modern English or any living language. But as he spoke, something responded. The light from the pit intensified. The carved symbols began to pulse in rhythm with his words, not glowing brighter but becoming more present, more real, as if they were pushing through from another dimension into this one. The air pressure changed. His ears popped. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees in 5 seconds, and then the world split. There was no other way to describe it. Grayson's consciousness separated, one part remaining in his body kneeling at the pit's edge, the other part pulled down and through, into a space that was not space, a geometry that did not follow Euclidean rules. He could see himself from 2 positions simultaneously. From above, looking down at his own kneeling form, blood dripping from his hand. From below, looking up from within the pit, seeing the night sky above but also seeing through it to something else, a vast structure of light and pattern extending in directions that had no names. The threshold was not a door. It was a mechanism, intricate and ancient, built from principles he could barely comprehend. Stone and earth and accumulated will, layered across centuries, holding back something that pressed constantly from the other side. The seal the Druids had created was not physical, but conceptual, a pattern maintained by collective agreement, by the weight of human belief given form through ritual. The Germans had broken part of that pattern. They had erased lines, removed pieces, creating gaps through which other things could push. The figures in gray uniforms were just symptoms, dead soldiers whose bodies had become convenient vessels for awareness that had waited millennia for an opening. But the mechanism could be repaired. Grayson could see how, could trace the broken connections, could identify where new lines needed to be drawn. All he had to do was maintain this split consciousness long enough to do the work. The pain started immediately. Not physical pain, though his body kneeling at the pit's edge was screaming silently as nerves misfired and systems designed for unified consciousness tried to cope with division. This was something worse. The sensation of being torn, of existence itself fragmenting, of the coherent self that thought and remembered and planned dissolving into component pieces that no longer recognized each other. He could feel himself dying. Not all at once, but in stages, like a structure collapsing one support at a time. Thoughts scattered, memories fragmented. The man named Arthur Grayson began to come apart at the seams. But not yet. Not quite yet. He focused on the pattern, on the broken lines in the threshold structure. With hands that existed in the space that was not space, he began to redraw them. Not with blood or tools, but with will, with conscious intention forcing reality to bend. Each line required absolute clarity, perfect visualization, the kind of mental precision he had learned through years of archaeological study, cataloging patterns, understanding how structures held together. Harris's voice reached him from a vast distance, shouting something. He could not make out the words. His body at the pit's edge had begun to shake, convulsions starting in his hands and spreading inward. Blood flowed freely now, pooling on the stone. James was speaking too, words tumbling out in a panic. The radio on his back was transmitting, voices pouring through in a dozen languages, a chorus of the dead offering encouragement, or warning, or prayer. Bennett had dropped to his knees, hands pressed over his eyes, unable to watch. Grayson traced the third line, then the fourth. The mechanism was responding, the broken pattern beginning to hold together. The light in the pit intensified further, becoming painful to look at even with eyes that existed partially outside normal space. The fifth line. The sixth. His consciousness was fraying badly now, thoughts coming apart like wet paper, identity dissolving. He could no longer remember his parents' faces, could not recall his grandmother's voice. Whitby was just a word, Cambridge an abstraction. Even his own name had become uncertain, syllables without referent. But the pattern remained clear. That was all that mattered. Not who was drawing it, only that it be completed. The seventh line. The structure locked into place. The threshold, which had been torn open and left gaping, began to close. Not instantly, but progressively, like a wound healing in accelerated time. The corpse light dimmed. The pressure in the air normalized. The wrongness that had saturated the moor since the Germans' ritual began to recede. Grayson drew the eighth and final line, connecting end to beginning, completing the circuit. The threshold sealed. The shock of closure threw his consciousness back into his body with physical force. He gasped, drawing air into lungs that had forgotten to breathe, heart hammering against ribs. The world snapped back into single perspective. The division ended. The pain that had been building toward unbearable suddenly cut off, leaving only aftermath. Exhaustion, disorientation, and a strange, hollow sensation, as if parts of himself had been left behind in the space between. He collapsed forward, catching himself on his hands, blood from his cut palm mixing with mud and peat. Around them, the fog began to lift. Not all at once, but visibly, thinning and pulling back, revealing first the immediate camp, then the moor beyond. Stars appeared overhead, their light no longer filtered through unnatural haze. The moon, dark tonight but present, showed as an absence against constellations Grayson recognized. Orion, rising in the east, the plow overhead. The figures in gray uniforms stood motionless for 3 more seconds. Then, like candles extinguished by a sudden wind, they were gone. Not fading, not walking away. Simply ceasing to be, presence removed from the world as abruptly as it had manifested. Silence fell over the moor. Real silence, not the oppressive weight of before, but simple absence of sound, the quiet of cold November night in empty country. James pulled off the radio headphones. The voices had stopped. Only static remained, ordinary white noise, the normal emptiness of a dead frequency. Harris and Bennett approached Grayson slowly, uncertain whether to help or simply observe. He waved them off, forcing himself upright into a sitting position. His left hand still bled, though the flow had slowed. Bennett, recovering his function as medic, pulled a field dressing from his kit and wrapped the wound with the automatic efficiency of training. Grayson's watch read 0211. The entire procedure, from beginning to end, had taken 24 minutes. It had felt like hours. He checked the compass, hanging from his belt. The needle pointed steady north, no longer spinning or erratic. The truck, if they could reach it, might start. The radio might work. The moor had returned to being simple, difficult terrain rather than hostile supernatural territory. They had succeeded. The cost remained to be calculated. Grayson could feel it already. Something missing, some part of himself left behind in the space between worlds. His memories were intact, mostly, though some seemed distant, belonging to someone he had once been rather than who he was now. His sense of self felt thinner, more provisional, as if the boundary between himself and the world around him had become permeable. The medieval monk had warned of this. Those who separated their consciousness rarely returned entirely whole. They became liminal themselves, caught between states, never fully present again. Grayson suspected he would spend the rest of his life feeling slightly displaced, a ghost inhabiting his own body. But he was alive. His men were alive, and the threshold was sealed. The German dead, their bodies arranged around the now dark pit, remained unchanged. Grayson gave orders to leave them. Let the army deal with recovery, with investigation, with whatever official explanation would be invented for this incident. His patrol's role was finished. They gathered what they could carry, the British equipment, a few of the German documents for intelligence purposes, and began the walk back toward their abandoned truck. The ground was still difficult, peat and mud and hidden holes, but navigable. Stars provided enough light to avoid the worst hazards. At 03:47, after 96 minutes of slow progress, they found the truck. It sat exactly where they had left it, axles buried in peat, engine cold. James climbed into the driver's seat and tried the ignition without much hope. The engine turned over on the second attempt. It coughed, sputtered, and caught, settling into a rough idle that was the most beautiful sound Grayson had heard in years. They were 6 miles from the nearest road, 12 miles from the last British checkpoint. The drive took 2 hours, navigating by compass and memory, following tracks that were barely visible even in starlight. They reached the main road at 05:52, 13 minutes before dawn. The checkpoint sentry, a corporal from a line regiment pulling overnight duty, stared at them as if they were apparitions. 4 men in torn, mud-caked uniforms, exhausted beyond measure, one with a bandaged hand, all with expressions that suggested they had seen things that did not belong in any official report. The corporal asked where the rest of their patrol was. Grayson answered that they had casualties, details to follow, and he needed immediate communication with command. The corporal, sensing this was above his authority level, made the call without further questions. By 07:30, Grayson was in a debriefing room with 2 intelligence officers and a colonel whose insignia indicated Special Operations Executive, the branch that handled irregular warfare and operations outside standard military doctrine. He told them everything: the fog, the Germans, the threshold, the ritual, the cost of closure. They took notes, asked clarifying questions. Their expressions remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing of whether they believed him or thought he had suffered some kind of breakdown. After 3 hours, the colonel closed his notebook and informed Grayson that his report would be classified above top secret, that he and his surviving men would be reassigned immediately to different units across different theaters, and that they were never to discuss this incident with anyone, under any circumstances, for the remainder of their service and beyond. The threat was implicit but clear. Speak about this, and consequences would follow. Grayson agreed. What choice did he have? Harris, James, and Bennett were interviewed separately, gave consistent accounts, and received the same instructions. By week's end, they had been scattered. Harris to a line regiment in the Netherlands, James to signals duty in Belgium, Bennett to a replacement depot in southern England. None of them saw each other again for the duration of the war. Grayson received 2 weeks of medical leave, officially for exhaustion and minor injuries sustained during patrol operations. He spent them in a military hospital near London, sleeping 12 hours a day, eating when reminded, staring at walls and trying to reassemble the pieces of himself into something resembling a functional officer. The doctors found nothing physically wrong beyond the cut on his palm, which healed normally. Psychologically, they noted signs of stress and trauma consistent with extended combat service, but nothing that warranted discharge or extended treatment. He was cleared for duty on 20th of November 1944. He returned to his unit and served through the end of the war, participating in the crossing of the Rhine and the final advance into Germany. He performed his duties competently, received no particular commendations, and attracted no particular attention. His superiors noted in efficiency reports that he seemed somehow diminished, less present than before, but attributed it to combat fatigue. On 8 May 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Captain Arthur Grayson stood in a German town whose name he could never later remember and watched soldiers celebrate the end of 6 years of war. He felt nothing in particular. Not joy, not relief, just a distant acknowledgement that one phase of history had ended and another would begin. He was 28 years old. He would live another 43 years, dying of heart failure in 1988 in a village in Gloucestershire, having never finished his thesis, having never returned to archaeology, having spent his post-war life working for the Ministry of Public Works, inspecting roads and bridges and other structures built by the living for the use of the living. His obituary in the local paper noted his military service, his years of government employment, his quiet nature, and his tendency to avoid crowds. It did not mention that he had closed a door between worlds with his own hands and lost pieces of himself in the process. Exmoor remained off limits to the public for 18 months after the incident, officially due to unexploded ordnance and dangerous ground. When it reopened, the area around the German camp was quietly purchased by the Ministry of Defense and designated a permanent restricted zone. Fences went up. Warning signs were posted. Local residents were told, truthfully enough, that contamination from wartime activities made the area unsafe. The site was checked annually for decades by specialists whose job descriptions never quite matched what they actually did. The reports, filed in archives that civilians never accessed, used carefully neutral language. Boundary markers stable, no evidence of structural degradation, threshold integrity maintained within acceptable parameters. As of 1988, when Arthur Grayson died, the seal still held. Whether it holds still in the year 2026 is a question for those who monitor such things. Some doors, once opened, never quite close all the way.